Welcome to our third lesson for Module 7. So this lesson is specifically going to focus on cellular transport. So by the end of this, you should be able to describe the steps and compounds, so like things needed for cellular transport to occur. So new vocab words are diffusion, dynamic equilibrium, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, and isotonic solution, and then hypotonic solution, hypertonic solution, and active transport, endocytosis, and exocytosis. So let's start with diffusion. So hopefully this is something that you've at least heard of before, but particles in solids, liquids, and gases are in constant random motion. So we talked about that briefly when we covered chemistry and biology. Diffusion is the net movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So there's a lot of them over here, not a lot of them over here, so they're going to kind of diffuse to even out. Additional energy is not required for diffusion because the particles are already in motion. It just naturally happens. We don't have to do anything to make that happen. When diffusion occurs over a long enough time, concentrations will become uniform and the solution will reach dynamic equilibrium. In dynamic equilibrium, molecules continue to move, but the concentration remains the same. So diffusion causes this is like ink in water. So diffusion causes the ink to move from high ink concentration to low ink concentration till the color becomes evenly blended in the water. So if we have blue over here and then nothing over here, slowly but surely that blue is going to bleed through. And that doesn't mean that these are just, this one is going over here. They're constantly in motion going back and forth, but they just even out. So diffusion across the plasma membrane. So water can diffuse across the plasma membrane, but most other substances cannot. The pores are too small. So facilitated diffusion uses transport proteins to move ions and small molecules across the plasma membrane. Diffusion and facilitated diffusion are types of passive transport. They don't require any energy. They can happen on their own. So this is an example of facilitated diffusion. So water moves freely through the plasma membrane here, but other substances cannot pass through on their own. Channel proteins, which we see here in B, and carrier proteins in C, help ions and small molecules move across. So a channel protein, it's a channel. It's just kind of like a pore going through. Carrier proteins, it's facilitated, so once something happens to like open this side up so that guy is able to go through. So osmosis is specifically diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane. So permeable means things can go through it. Selectively means only some things can go through it. So osmosis is specifically diffusion of only water across a selectively permeable membrane. Water is the solvent in a cell and in its environment. Water will move across the membrane until concentration of solute is the same on both sides. That'll make more sense in the coming slides. So before osmosis, the sugar concentration is greater on the right side. After osmosis, the concentrations are the same on both sides. Water molecules continue to move across the membrane. So right here, if we counted the yellow dots, that would be sugar. There is way less over here than there is over here. That means the concentration of water in relation to the concentration of sugar is different. So the sugar cannot cross the membrane, but water can. So because there's way more sugar over here, the water is going to go through that membrane to even out that concentration so that the percentage of sugar to water is the same on both sides. So even though that goes against gravity and what would be, equal for this U shape, because of that selectively permeable membrane, only the water can get through, and so it's going to go against gravity to make that happen. So we're going to talk about three different types of solutions. The first is an isotonic solution. That has the same concentration of water in solutes as the cytoplasm of a cell. So it's equal. The same concentration of sugar and whatever, the solute, is inside the cell as outside. So water is just equally going in and out. Water still moves through the membrane, but it enters and leaves at the same rate. A hypotonic solution has a lower concentration of solutes in the cytoplasm of the cell. So we have less solutes over here, more of them in the cell. So more water is going in than going out. But still, there is water continuously moving in and out. So net movement is more going in, but as water moves into the cell, the pressure increases. So it just will fill with more and more and more water. Animal cells can burst when they're placed in extremely hypotonic solution. So if we put animal cells into pure distilled water, they will actually burst, which is why it's theoretically not good to drink straight pure water. We need the minerals in it. The same can happen with when you have an IV. If an IV isn't the perfect salinity, the perfect concentration, it can cause your blood cells to burst. So a hypertonic solution is the opposite. So remember, think of hyper is like a lot. So too much solute, more solute. It has a higher concentration of solutes than the cytoplasm of the cell, which means water is going to leave the cell to even it out. There is still some water going in because it's constantly going back and forth, but more water is leaving the cell than coming in. As that happens, pressure decreases and it can shrivel. So this is what happens with plants. So if you don't water your plants, the soil is going to have more solutes than it does water. Water is going to leave those plant cells and the plants are going to wilt. All right, active transport. So sometimes substances must move from an area of lower concentration to an area of higher concentration. Movement of particles across the cell membrane against the concentration gradient requires energy and is called active transport. Active transport occurs with the aid of carrier proteins, which are often called pumps. I did not highlight this, but it is something you'll have to write down. So this is an example of a pump. So this is sodium and potassium ATPase pumps. These pumps are found in the plasma membrane of animal cells. They maintain levels of sodium and potassium inside and outside of the cell. So it requires sodium and then ATP to release that sodium. And then as the potassium comes in, it releases a specific protein. So large molecules such as sugar need to move against a concentration gradient into a cell. So we want a higher percentage of it in the cell versus out. So natural diffusion won't work. So in a process called coupled transport, sugars can pair with sodium ions and enter the cell through a membrane protein called a coupled channel. Coupled transport allows sugars to enter through facilitated diffusion, which saves energy. So endocytosis is the process by which a cell surrounds an object in the outside environment in a portion of the plasma membrane. This is for very large particles. Exocytosis is the excretion of materials at the plasma membrane. So it looks like this. So endo is inside, so we're taking that big thing inside. So it like creates a bubble from the outside of the cell and brings it in. Exocytosis is the opposite. So this is waste. So it'd be a vesicle. We are going to move this bubble out. Eventually it will bond with the cell membrane that's already there and release that waste. All right, really quick review question time. Which is not a factor that affects the rate of diffusion? Conductivity, concentration, pressure, or temperature. So which does not affect it? Not concentration, not pressure, not temperature. All of those affect the rate. It's going to be conductivity. That does not affect the rate of diffusion at all. Which type of transport requires energy input from the cell? Active transport, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, or simple diffusion. Simple diffusion takes no energy, neither does osmosis, and neither does facilitated diffusion. Only active transport takes energy. Which type of solution could cause an animal cell to burst? Hypotonic, isotonic, homeostatic, or hypertonic? Not hypertonic. This would cause a plant cell to shrivel. Isotonic would be even on both sides. Homeostatic, we did not even talk about. It's going to be hypotonic. That can cause an animal cell to burst because all of the water is rushing into the cell. By which method of transport can large substances enter a cell? Endocytosis, facilitated diffusion, exocytosis, or osmosis. Not facilitated diffusion, that would be for really small things. Not exocytosis, that would be kicking big things out. And osmosis is just water. So it's going to be endocytosis. All right, that is the end of this lesson. Please let me know if you have any questions. I will add additional resources for these topics onto Canvas because I know it is a little bit complicated. So I'll add some videos that have some better like moving graphics to explain. But let me know if you have any questions and I will see you in the next one.